forgot it does that now.
Okay, so hello everybody, I'm Laura Roughan. I'm a consultant clinical psychologist in the CAMS service in Southampton. We were going to have Chantal Homan, who's the service manager, quality manager as well, but she's dipped out today and left me in charge. So you may have seen some other talks that I've done before on kind of anxiety management and oppositional behaviour. This one's not hugely different, but hopefully I'll have some different ways of thinking about it and different strategies you can try as well. So the aim is to gain an understanding of the reasons for kind of angry behaviour, to identify some strategies to support what we might call emotion regulation, and to identify skills that you can practice with your child and to help them support their own self-regulation. So, oh, it all flashed up, wasn't expecting that. So what is anger? So anger is an emotional state that varies in intensity from mild irritation to intense fury and rage. So I expect you're all very familiar with what your child is like when they're angry. So they might be having a tantrum behavior, throwing things, shouting, screaming, slamming doors, that kind of thing. So that's what you might see, but actually anger is a result of kind of physiological and biological changes in our body. So when you get angry, if you can think a moment just what it's like for you when you get angry, you might notice that your heart rate goes quicker, your blood pressure goes up, you feel very tense, you maybe not thinking clearly, and what we know is that our hormones and adrenaline levels also change, and this is part of what happens to our body when we get angry. So you may have heard of something called the fright, flight and freeze scenario that goes on in your body. We talk about this when we talk about anxiety, but we also experience this when we feel angry. So we might get the sweaty palms, the peripheral vision, feeling hot, difficulties thinking, concentrating. So the first thing I want to say is that anger is often a response to something, but underneath that, the physiological sensations and changes in the body are kind of a sign of stress or anxiety. So we really need to think when we see this angry behavior, what's going on for that young person, what's underneath it. So we know that anger or stress, which is what I'll probably use the terms interchangeably, and ASD are really common. So they've got increased levels of environmental stressors that these young people are dealing with. So noise, lots of people is a very stressful situation for them often. There's a higher correlation with this kind of sensory processing difficulty. So we know that children with ASD often have difficulties managing noise or managing textures, and those things sort of add to the stress levels that they experience. We know that there's sort of genetic links. They're more likely to experience negative social experiences. So it's usually the young person is picked on because other people know that they're a bit more vulnerable, or they can't take jokes. They're very literal in their understanding of the world. So people might pick on that and to make them have that angry response because it's amusing to young people or something like that. So they're more likely to have those experiences at school. They have difficulties making sense of the world, difficulties accepting and understanding change. So we know that there's a lot of anxiety in children with autism because of the change of routine or the unpredictability of the environment around them. And that can result in angry behavior, or what you might see as angry behavior. Difficulties seeing the impact behavior has on others is also an important part. So they might be having an angry outburst, but they won't be noticing that perhaps you've had a hard day, that actually you're very upset about something, or you haven't got time to manage this, or you're just overwhelmed with managing this. They're not going to be thinking about those parts. Angry responses in ASD often mean greater difficulties with social skills. So they get angry quickly, they're going to find social situations more difficult, and their social response is going to be poorer. similarly, they're going to be less socially responsive to other people. Often, if you've got more stress, more angry behaviour, you're going to have greater difficulty with the ASD symptoms. So the more anxiety, the more the ASD side of things gets worse, and more functional impairment as well. So we know if you're more stressed, they're more likely to have a meltdown, they're more likely to struggle with school and social situations. So this has lots of pops. So I'll fill them all in and I'll start talking. So I might have used this when I talk about the bucket of worries. It's also thinking we could call this the bucket of stress, or where all our anger goes and what contributes to it. So we've got changes of routine, or concept of time, difficulties understanding words, difficulties understanding communication, the sensory difficulties. So some of those things will add stress to this young person, and eventually what then happens is we get too much stress, so our bucket gets full, it then overflows, and we might see that only just a small bit overflows, but that can mean a disaster for that young person. So a small drop added to the bucket, so or haven't got your fish fingers for tea, might result in the biggest meltdown, because that young person's been adding to that bucket all day. So they've had problems with friends, problems with homework, school stress, noise all day, and then just you not having what they were expecting for tea, entire meltdown. And something someone can cope with one day may cause a meltdown on another day. So that's exactly that example, is that there might be some flexibility around that one day, but another day they just can't cope because they've had too much other stress. So I think the other thing when we're thinking about anger is really to think about what's underneath the behaviour. So I like to use this analogy of an iceberg. So if you think of an iceberg, it floats around in the sea and you can just see the tip of it. And underneath that is a great load of other stuff under that surface that we can't see. So your child having meltdowns, you see as angry behaviour or difficult behaviour, challenging behaviour, but actually what might be underneath. So here we've got an example of an angry meltdown in the evening after school. So it's a bit like what I've just said. So what's underneath the surface for that young person? Well, they're tired from the overload of the school day. They've had a big transition from school, the structure and organisation, and listening to the teacher, to home. This is where we play. This is where I have siblings. This is where I have mum and dad that care for me. Not understanding others' needs. So regardless of where they whether they're at home or school, they've had to deal with like not understanding what other people are thinking and what feeling the whole time. They might be feeling frustrated with this new social situation with people live within it, so their siblings or their parents. They're not knowing how to ask for things or explain things. So again, with the example I gave earlier, they might not be able to say, I've had a really tough day, or I'm really tired from today. In which case, if they were able to do that, you might be able to manage a situation differently to them not saying anything, and then all of a sudden there's a meltdown. They've got difficulties processing verbal information. So they may have been coping with that all day at school, and then you pick them up, and like any normal parent will do, you start asking lots of questions. How was your homework? What was the day? What did you do? What did you say to that person? What did the teacher say about your weekend, your show and tell? And that's just a lot of information for that young person to process when they're already feeling quite overwhelmed. They might be inflexible and rigid, and so you saying you don't have the right type of fish fingers today, but you've got these other ones, just maybe just too much, because the rigidity of wanting that one is too upsetting to change. And there may be a change of routine going on. So you've said no fish fingers tonight, we're having sausages, and it's just underneath that angry response is a lot of overwhelming feelings, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety going on. So this is the same example up here, but we might think about how we can manage that. So we've got different strategies that we might implement, such as after school, you might have a quiet time or time out of demands, and that will allow the young person to sort of re-regulate themselves. You might want to teach them some social skills to use in different situations. So perhaps you find that after school, the young person's always fighting with the siblings, or the play gets out of hand, and actually maybe it's teaching them how to play a board game. So they learn to take turns, they learn to manage the disappointment of losing, rather than that being so overwhelming and it becomes a big meltdown. You may give them time for special interests, because actually they've had a hard day. Maybe they just want to play with their trains on their own, doing their own thing, and that will allow them to self-regulate their emotions a bit. And you might use reward charts. You may sort of suggest that, you know, if they can manage this half an hour playing with their sibling, they get a reward, and teaching them to do that. Or if they can learn use a different strategy, which we're going to talk about as we go through this today, they can show that they can use that instead of getting angry, or showing their anger in aggression, that they get a reward for that. So teaching them some self-regulation, but then getting them to use it, and motivation for that. So what kind of things might we implement while doing these things? Well, we might use visuals. So we might have, when we get home from school, there's a visual of hang up your coat, take off your shoes, you go to the playroom, siblings goes to the lounge or something, you know, or you go to your bedroom, or you have different corners, the red corner and the blue corner, where they can have some quiet time and do other things. You may use social stories, so explaining that actually when they lose a game and have a meltdown, that makes everybody else quite sad, and that when they shout and scream, other people get scared, so that they start to get an understanding of what the impact of their behaviour is on others. And you may use timers to help with transitions. So you might find that angry outbursts happen a lot after you saying, come on, it's dinner time, you need to get off that computer. Actually, you might need to use warnings and things, and those will prevent some of those angry outbursts. I think it's also important to think who can support you with this, because actually if you have lots of issues in the evening, what can school do to help that young person regulate throughout the day? Because actually if they're holding it all in, managing all their stress, and then they're coming home and just having an angry meltdown, what can we do to regulate throughout the day? And what can siblings do to support that as well? So I know we ask a lot from siblings, but perhaps explaining to the sibling why the young person gets angry and what things it is that they do that they find difficult. So it might be that they come and get their noisy drum out when the person's doing homework, and that causes a meltdown. Or maybe we say, well, actually the drum is not to be used during homework. So it's kind of negotiating with the family on how we can support the young person with ASD. Oh, every so often it likes to do a thing where it just stops. Okay, so I popped one in the slide. So when I send these to you, you can always use this page to sort of have a go at your own. So let's have a think about kind of what's in your child's emotion regulation toolbox. So we know that young people, that everybody has strategies, but children with autism seem to have less, or don't know how to implement them, or struggle. And I'll explain a little bit about why that is. So if we think of the strategies we use, we might use mutual regulation. So that's asking for help, that's talking to somebody about something we're finding difficult. It's maybe getting help from a friend, getting help to problem solve. All those things are really reliant on social communication skills. So you might pick up your phone and chat to your friend when something's going difficult, or ask your partner, say, you know, it's been a really hard day, can I talk this through? Actually, those are skills that children with autism don't have, or find very difficult to access. So that's not going to help them. The other thing we do quite a lot of is self-talk. So I can say, oh, I've had a really stressful day. Come on, you can do it. You're nearly finished. Just keep going for another half an hour and then it'll be time to go home. So I always, encourage myself with self-talk. I might also do things like, if I'm really stressed out, take myself out of the situation and count to 10. But again, all these sort of strategies in my head, nobody else would know I'm doing them, but they're really reliant on language skills. So if they don't have the language, the understanding, the ability to sort of think about keeping it in your head for yourself, because other people will notice it, then that's quite a difficult skill to use. And then we also will do other things to self-regulate. So in this, we've got a picture of a person chewing a pen. So that person is thinking while chewing their pen because that's a strategy they've used to self-regulate. I sometimes do things like pull my fingers, or you might have people that sort of stroke their hair, those kind of things. Now, children with autism have slightly more extreme versions of this, so they need more of this sensory feedback often to self-regulate. So they might flap, they might rock, they might hit themselves. Those are kind of their version of self-regulation. So if you just keep an eye on what you do or what other people in your family do, or in meetings and things, you will pick up that other people are doing subtle self-regulation things. That might be stroking, it might be tapping, those kind of things, but children with autism have more extreme versions. So being aware of what they do to self-regulate is a really useful thing to think about how you can support them with it. So just some questions for you to think about. I won't give you time to think about them now, but in the future is what does your child do when they're stressed out, and how might they not have, and why might they not have all the strategies that other children have? So just touching on some sensory stuff. So we've got these senses that we all have: taste, smelling, hearing. But we know that children with autism have more stress from these things. So we can block them out. So if I tune in, I can hear my fridge whirring, and I can hear the computer whirring, and I can hear something going on outside. But I'm concentrating on this, so I'm able to knock those sounds out. Children with autism often can't, so it becomes very anxiety provoking. That activates their fight and flight system. They're oversensitive to all this stimuli that's going on. They're unable to cope with it or block it out, and then we see this stress and this behavior. So it's important to think about what's going on in the environment for them, more than we would a typical developing person. So predicting our anger and stress, I like to talk about this. You would have seen I just sort of occasionally do this, and I'm talking about regulation. So a straight line is when we're regulated, and then we have this arousal level that goes up, and in the middle, that's where it's kind of exploded. So I like to think of everybody having a kind of 4-stage emotional regulation arousal curve. So we'll have happy, engaged, content is stage 1. So that's when they're self-regulated or they're regulated. And then the stage 2 is the important one, because this is the ones that show you that your child is struggling. And that's when you need to intervene to do something to calm them down. Because if you're starting to see lots of pushing boundaries, getting frustrated, lots of noises, throwing things across the table, not able to concentrate, that's when you need to go, right, let's remove those demands and let's do something different, or let's take a break and go and get out all the sensory toys. Because what will happen is, if they can't self-regulate, they tip into that stage 3, which is when you're having a tantrum and a meltdown and seeing aggressive behavior, oppositional behavior, angry behavior. And then the stage 4 is where it all comes down, because if we're thinking of stage 3 being that fight and flight, the fight and flight hits and our body can't stay in that mode forever. So eventually it is going to come down. And that's usually what you'll see is sulking, crying, not communicating, being quiet, maybe doing something on their own, maybe taking themselves off. What we want them to do is to be able to get to that stage before they hit stage 3. So I've talked through some of these, I think, are very similar to the anxiety ones. So I might just flick through them because I know we're running short on time. But it's thinking about supporting communication. So again, when we have this angry response, I think a lot of what I talk about is avoiding that angry response. When you're in that, there's obviously ways to manage it, and I'll go on to those later, but we want to avoid your child getting angry. So we want to support their communication, to avoid those misunderstandings, to avoid frustrations turning into meltdowns. So with a child that doesn't have all the language or is younger, you might use visuals like this. So can I, helping them to communicate, can I play with that toy, rather than snatching it off because they thought it was their turn, which then results in more poor social skills and more poor social experiences. But with older children or children that have lots of language, you might use just visual timetables that have words or pictures or both on. So I've got one here for a younger child that's got pictures and words that might just be something you could have in the evening of kind of what happens after school. So as I said earlier, put up your coat and your bag and your shoes, go to your quiet place. You can play with your cars. After that, we then do homework. Then it's another rest time, and then it's dinner time or something like that. And similarly, you might have one for an older child where they have the words and they can tick them off so that they take some responsibility themselves. So visual timetables, I know we always talk about these when we're talking about managing autism, but they are so helpful. And if you're seeing lots of meltdowns and outbursts, it's often because every demand you put on them, they weren't expecting. Even though it's the same every day, it's not part of their agenda. So get an agenda that you share and that's there, that you can all see, and those meltdowns should reduce. The other big part of it is emotion regulation, because recognition. Sorry, I keep using the wrong words. Emotion recognition, because we're talking about what we see, which looks like anger, but actually, are they angry? Are they just very sad or very worried or stressed? And it's having those words and using visuals with the young person to explain those. And I would use those with teenagers as well. So it's not just thinking about younger children, but you could make something like a 5-point scale. You can make it appropriate for the age. So these look like slightly younger children, but I've had really 16, 17-year-olds that have drawn their own pictures of how they're feeling, and they just have it laminated somewhere at home, and they can just point to where they are when they just feel like, Mum, you're just getting on my nerves, you're saying the wrong things, I'm a 4, can you leave me alone? And so that's quite a good strategy, just to have the numbers, the faces around the house, or a way of communicating with the young person so that when they're getting angry, they can tell you, because you might not be able to see it until it's at breaking point. The other way of doing this, maybe to use some emotion key rings that they can show you what emotion they're feeling. And again, older children can do this. You just adapt it to make it a bit more subtle, or a little more, sometimes they have it on their apps, and things like that. Also, another technique we'd use a lot in anxiety, but if we're thinking about the fight and flight system and what goes on in our bodies, it's an immediate adrenaline release, and it's really hard for anybody to control it. If you think of a time that you got angry with someone, or you got really scared about something, or really anxious, your fight and flight system will be activated. And what we have to do is always slow down our breathing, slow down our heart rate, for all the other things to slow down and for us to become calmer. So teaching your young person some relaxation techniques is also really helpful for anger. And again, it would be noticing when they're getting frustrated and then putting something in place, not waiting until they're at melting point, because then you're not going to get anywhere. You can find lots of resources online about these things, lots of kind of online tapes, videotapes, verbal kind of talk you through things, or just if all else fails, deep breathe, slow breathing is a really good one. So just thinking a bit more about sensory stuff. We know that we were talking about how we might self-regulate with very subtle sensory things. Children with autism might need a bit more going on. So the OTs, so I've been told, say that sort of heavy work, movement, deep pressure and vibration are the most sensory regulating feelings that you can have. So you might have some exercise things that you can use. So things like stress balls, because that's sort of, what's it doing? It's not heavy work, but it's using your muscles, tensing your muscles. Or you might have a weight that you just pick up because that helps them regulate. You might use things like trampolines, scooters, spinning. You see children spinning around. Those kind of things provide a lot of regulation, and use them throughout the day. You don't use them just when they're feeling frustrated, but get school to use something throughout the day to help them keep regulating. You might find that a young person really likes deep pressure, and having a deep pressure rub after school might be enough to keep them calmer through the evening. The other things to think about are warning children when there's going to be some loud noises, or using things to prevent that. So I know lots of people use noise cancelling headphones, or make a quiet space they can go to when you're doing the drilling or the hoovering or something. And we've talked about using visuals a lot as well. So how to manage these responses. So just using the diagram I had earlier, we've got ways to sort of strategies to keep children at different levels. So if we think of stage 1, we want to be constantly using praise and rewards with those children, giving them lots of breaks on activities, structuring the time and using timetables, using regular relaxation, and giving clear choices. So if you know you don't have those favorite fish fingers, you can say you don't offer them. You say you don't point out that you don't have them. You don't offer them. You go, tonight we could have sausages or pizza or something like that. So you've given them what they feel like is a controlled choice, a choice that you are control of. The second stage, if we think about, this is when the young person might be getting a bit stressed, and that's when we might redirect them to something else, give them a break, get your sensory toys out for doing something, or have some relaxation strategies, go to a calm space. So that's when you know they're getting frustrated, taking them out of that situation before it gets too much. And this might involve supervising the homework a bit more, or supervising the sibling play a bit more, so that you can make that call and intervene. Because once you get to that stage 3, that's when they're in fight and flight zone. Nothing you say is going to go in. So just keep your verbal communication to a minimum. Maybe use very straightforward instructions like, it's time to calm down. Consider risk, so remove other children if you can't remove that child. Reduce all the stimulation. So that's when you want to really think about the environment, get rid of all the sounds, get rid of the TV, the music, the bright lights, because that will reduce their arousal levels. And at this stage, do not reason or tell them what they've done wrong, or try and talk through that kind of thing. Just get them to the point where they can calm themselves down. And then stage 4, you don't want to tip back into stage 3. So it's usually best to sort of give clear choices, to remain calm, and keep demands low at that point. So we know, I feel like I'm ending on a bit more of a negative thing, but what can escalate anger? We know that trying to negotiate, trying to explain are problems that definitely occur, because when you're faced with an angry child, you're going to say, but the reason we can't do that is because, so we can't go to the park because it's raining. And I guess that's us using our verbal skills to help reason, which makes sense to us and would possibly make sense to a typical child. but somebody with autism or a non-verbal toddler, for example, they can't understand that at that point. So you just keep it all to a minimum. We may forget to use the kind of relaxation and giving space and away from demands before that point of anger. So we need to add those into daily routine, really. So you might be doing homework, it might be an expectation they do an hour's homework a night. You might say, right, we're going to have 20 minutes and then we're going to have a 10-minute on the trampoline, or we're going to have a 10 minutes, you can play with these squidgy balls, or you can go and run up the stairs 10 times, or whatever it is, so that then it's broken up into reasonable chunks for them. So you want to remember also what lies underneath the angry response. So I think sometimes as parents, you can get very frustrated and very irritated with the behavior, which is completely understandable because you've also had a tiring day and now you've got a child that's having a meltdown. Actually, sometimes thinking about, they're not doing this to annoy you, they're not doing this to wind you up, but actually they're feeling very stressed and very worried about something. And thinking of it that way can make you feel a little bit calmer and a little bit more, almost more prepared to manage it, than thinking this child is doing this on purpose and it's really annoying. You don't want to talk about challenging the behavior straight after, because that's when they're feeling very sensitive and it might reinstigate it all. I always think of it as like a fire. If you keep putting things on the fire, if you keep talking, if you keep explaining, it's just going to get worse. If you don't want to get stuck in that kind of authority dynamic. Again, that's a very social kind of construct that children with autism may not understand. So you may have a child where the teacher is sort of saying, no, I'm the teacher, this is how it is. But a typical child might be quite scared of that and, okay, right, I've crossed the line, I need to stop. But a child with autism may not pick up on that kind of social hierarchy and just be like, no, this is how I'm doing it. And this person that's telling me off, I don't agree with them. You want to listen to the content, listen to the content and don't look at the emotion behind it. I'm not sure what that means. I think you want to change what's going on in terms of the emotion. It's probably the anger behavior is probably an emotional distress, whether it's worry, anxiety, stress. You don't want to forget that they've got language processing problems. They're also listening. So don't assume that they're listening, because they may not be. And don't take away strategies that are working. So sometimes the classic example is in school, they're not looking, but they are listening. They've got a squidgy ball. The teacher thinks they're distracted. The teacher takes their squidgy ball off, and that's just, they can't then cope. And within 10, 15 minutes, they're tapping, they're moving in their chair, they're not listening, they're looking around the room, and the teacher's like, right, I told you weren't listening, out you go. But actually keeping the sensory ball, they were able to listen. And it's similar at home. There'll be things that they do that might annoy you. So tapping something on the telly, on the settee, and you're saying, stop that, but actually you take that away, and then they're more dysregulated and easier aroused to sort of anger. Okay, so do have a think about what can go in your toolbox for regulation. So what sensory strategies work for them, what rewards could work, what things can you use to help them stay less angry. Support your child to minimize their stress, because that will reduce their anger. So do think about adding in things across the day that will help them to stay regulated. And ensure your regulation toolbox is not empty. All these things are things that you need to do for yourself as well. So if you can't find 5 minutes to have a cup of tea and take a break, then your arousal level is going to creep up and up and up all day. And then when they blow, you're probably going to blow as well. because it's going to be too much. So do think about what you need to do for yourself. And sometimes, you know, if there's 2 of you at home, can you have a tag team? Can you go, you know, a signal to say, I'm not coping with this. I need to take 5 minutes. You need to take over. And I appreciate some people won't be able to do that, but what else can you do? What can you share with your young person that when mummy needs 5 minutes, she just needs 5 minutes, and have rules in place around that. Oh, so I do end on something a little bit more cheerful, just some helpful strategies for preventing anger. So I think this is just a bit of a summary. Think about relaxation, think about reducing stimuli, use social stories, help other people understand the ASD, because like if the siblings know about it, they're probably going to modify their behaviour before they wind him up on purpose because it's funny. Plan ahead, use visual timetables, have a think about what causes miscommunications in your house and what you can do, what you might need to do differently to prevent those. Okay, there we go.